Hello there! Today on GVN Live, we will be talking about 3DO and Atari. I'm Fight Club Hubs, and welcome to GVN Live. So, welcome everybody. It is GVN Live, happening bi-weekly here on Mondays on Twitch and now on YouTube. With me is Jan, Mark, and Nick. How you guys doing today? And gal.
I'm fine. How are you?
Sorry, I had to correct myself before you yell at me again, Mark.
Listen. Don't be a dick.
I'm not trying to be a dick.
Don't be a dick.
I'm not a dick. Anyway, moving on. So, how are you, Nick? It's been a while since we've seen you. I believe the last time you were here, you joined us for the... Oh, no, you didn't get a chance to join us for the award show. So we missed you there.
Yeah, scheduling's hectic anymore, but I'm doing all right. Yourself?
I'm fabulous. Jan, how are you?
I'm doing well. Too many games, too little time.
Yeah.
Sounds like, yeah, the biggest problem every day. And Mark, how do you feel today?
I mean, I'm okay. I slept a lot. It was nice. I enjoyed it.
What's sleep? I don't know.
Sleep is the thing I do because I don't have kids.
Oh, rip.
Must be nice, motherfucker.
Wow.
Anyway,
We're just gonna start. It's
yeah,
fine.
we're starting
Sorry
off.
about it.
This is a nice raw start. Speaking of raw, let's just jump right into our first topic at hand, and let's talk about Atari, the company that just doesn't seem to have an identity this day and age. They want to do this, do some of that. They want your money. More importantly, apparently there was this thing I wanted to originally talk about, which was this crowdfunding shenanigan that they wanted to port roller coaster. Okay, now I'm having problems saying it. Damn you, Nick.
Yeah, it's not easy as you think, ain't it?
I did it just fine. You caused me to start stuttering it. Now, Roller Coaster Tycoon, they want to port it to the Nintendo Switch. Now, originally they didn't specify which version it was going to be ported. Was it going to be the mobile version of the game, or was it going to be the classic version of the game with just a remade touch? However, Nick, you said that this is actually not the case. It's not really a crowdfunding. So, what is this?
So first off,
this
is apparently an entirely original game. So it's not going to be a port. It's not going to be anything like that. It's it's Roller Coaster Tycoon. You know, the fundamental stuff is still going to be there, but this is going to be a completely different game compared to the mobile free-to-play version or any other previous version before it. So what they're doing here is they put the pitch for the game out on a funding platform called Start Engine, and it is crowdfunding, but not in the way that Kickstarter or Indiegogo works. This is more, I guess, sort of a traditional way, for lack of a better way of putting it right now.
Like investment capital, shit like that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, basically, the people that at Atari or representing Atari are making the pitch, but they're making it on this site instead of going directly to investors, and now the responsibility relies on investors to fund the project. And this site, Start Engine, had to go through regulations with the Security and Exchange Commission. It has rules and regulations set under the Jobs Act, which is the Jumpstart Our Business Startup Act. So there's federal stuff involved here. You kind of just want to pitch questions here, and I'll try to answer them as best I can based on the research I had, because it from what I found about Atari, there's just a lot of stuff going on, and it's kind of everywhere. And quite honestly, I didn't expect to go go this deep down the rabbit hole here because
So-
there's a lot of stuff.
Yeah, we're going to have to, unfortunately, go a little deep into the rabbit hole. We're going to go back at least about, 17 years when Atari was just a dying brand. And at that point, a little upstart company by the name of Infogrames came in and bought Atari, using them as like a secondary publishing house, using them to publish games on both PC and console. After about a year or so, then Atari was completely absorbed into Infogrames, and Infogrames literally just changed their name to Atari. So
right, they essentially just took Atari and started wearing them as sort of a skin suit.
Mm-hmm.
Because the name Infogrames had functional viability, sort of, but nobody was talking about them as a branding platform. So their mentality was, well, let's take the Atari brand and attach it to ourselves, just because even though Atari's dead, they still have some value, and that the Atari that's been around for the past couple of decades now at this point has been Infogrames with the Atari skin suit on tap.
Mm-hmm. Now, for at least several years, I would say halfway through the last console generation with the 360 and the PS3 and the Wii U, Atari just pretty much disappeared. I think they tried to change their business model to go more mobile gaming, because I can't recall any games that they really published for a time being, including they did publish some games on the PC, but they were like the original Neverwinter Nights and Neverwinter Nights 2 games. They published them for BioWare at the time, I believe, right, Mark? Was it?
They did it for a little bit.
I was saying this before the show, but I think their last major console game of note was the Ghostbusters game in 2008 or 9.
Yeah, that was like literally almost 9 years ago or so. The last game of significance, pretty much, from them. And after that, they kind of went into this state of limbo. Infogrames just, almost dropped off the face of the planet. And then at some point, I think they sold the Atari brand name just to some random investors that were up in New York City. And they were trying to figure out what to do with it. And I think in that period of time, they started releasing these grab-and-go gaming peripherals, plug-and-play video game-like things with like 10 to 20 Atari games on a little controller that you plug into your TV or whatnot. If I know they still do that. I went to Toys R Us not too long ago, and I saw like the little mini arcades with like 5 like games in them.
They also quietly really made a space for themselves in the mobile gaming market.
Yeah.
I mean, a bunch of casino games, simple free-to-play games using their properties from the past. They did it quietly, and I mean, it's kind of hard for our demographic to notice it because it's really not our thing. But they've kind of existed in the background this whole time.
Yeah, and Atari didn't really make a splash until last year with the big announcement of the Atari box, where they just mentioned it around E3, but they didn't give out any details until September of last year. We talked about it briefly on GVN Live back in October, and we were just speculating on like, is this even a good idea? And at this point, the Indiegogo page, as you pointed out, Nick, it's still not up. It's just sitting in limbo as well with the rest of the with the rest of Atari's like scheming or whatever. So like, what's going to be going on here? Like, does Atari at this point just really should just go away? Is there really a purpose for them to be just trying to make a name for themselves? Like, I don't know the CEO's name, but he seems to want to take pride in the Atari brand name.
It's Frederick Chesney. I think that's how you pronounce his last name. If not,
Chesney.
Chesney. If it is, well, you just confirmed that. But if I mispronounced it in any way, I'm sorry. You're probably not listening to this anyway. But
whatever.
If so, But yeah, I mean, I don't think Atari's going to go away. Like I said, they made a nice space for themselves in the mobile gaming market. So even if the Roller Coaster Tycoon Switch game doesn't work, and if the Atari box ever happens or not, I think the company, the way it is now, it'll be fine. It's just not the company that we've come to know anymore, and probably won't ever be that again.
Well, the thing to keep in mind is that it hasn't been in years, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Like, the original company, as we knew it, back from the 80s and 90s, died multiple times over.
Mm-hmm.
The original company that was just the Atari game development platform died when Infogrames bought that brand name and branded their game publishing to that. And then the proper Atari organization died when Infogrames bought them out in like 2001 or 2002, and just rebranded their whole business line as Atari.
Atari SA, yeah.
But even then, like back when Atari declared bankruptcy in 2013, everything that was the reinvented version of Atari was washed away like Noah with the flood, and the Atari that exists at this point is a zombified shell of a skin suit monster. It's the weirdest goddamn thing at this point, and the past couple of years of decisions for Atari in general have just been shit. You know, they sold off a bunch of their brand names that they weren't really doing anything with and could have, but like just weren't. You know, they sold off Star Control, they sold off Total Annihilation, they sold off Test Drive. They lost the Dragon Ball Z license for the games they had publishing. I think the only things that they really own at this point that anybody gives a shit about is Roller Coaster Tycoon and Alone in the Dark.
Mm-hmm.
And Alone in the Dark has been mostly
irrelevant at this point.
I don't even want to say irrelevant. Like, it's been kind of insultingly frustrating in a lot of respects.
Yeah.
Like, the Alone in the Dark remake, a lot of people, a lot of gaming hipsters, I'm just going to call it what it is. A lot of gaming hipsters like to talk about what a secretly great game Alone in the Dark was. And Tycho from Penny Arcade loves to talk about how people will someday wake up and realize they really loved it. And more recently, H Bomber Guy has been talking about the fact that it's generally a good game. Listen, fuck off. That game is terrible.
This is the 360.
I will never,
right?
ever. I will. What's that?
It's the 361, right? Where you open your jacket and look down to see your inventory.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, God.
I will never think that was a good game. The absolute best that I will give that game is that it came up with a couple of innovative concepts, but Dead Space did most of the shit that game was trying to do way better than Alone in the Dark ever could have.
And to answer Fun Push's question, yes, we're going to get to that at some point.
It's okay, Atari, you tried.
Yeah, but I mean, no, it isn't okay. They didn't try. Especially not with the most recent one, Illumine the Dark Illumination, the third-person shooter that they did. Like, I barely was even aware that came out until I saw Sterling do a video on it, and holy shit, that game was terrible. That was like the worst version of a horde mode game I think I have ever seen. And it's just, what they're doing now is just like, this is like the third or the fourth time they're trying to reinvent themselves at this point. It's just kind of ridiculous, honestly.
What were you going to say, Jan?
Well, so the thing I think is interesting out of all of this, though, is just that the fact that since the original press release in September, we haven't heard anything else about it, crowdfunding or not. So much to the point where a lot of people just flat out forgot it was even a thing until they just started announcing recently that they were starting to get into other side projects, such as getting into Atari tokens, I think is what they're calling it, which basically is a cryptocurrency. Mm-hmm. It's like, oh, hey, everything, is crypto now, so we might as well just go do cryptocurrency for Atari. Why not? That seems like the thing to get us back in the limelight. And I'm like, this all just seems like a desperate grab for me, because at this point, Atari is a name that, if you're under the age of 21 probably don't remember, and under the age of 18 and a gamer have no idea what that name is, other than maybe if you played Neverwinter Nights. And, you know, a lot of times you get to a point where you start hearing these older companies who are coming out of the woodwork from, you know, ages past, who may or may not had a massive hand in the original fall of the, you know, in the 80s, was a reason why people were just kind of looking at this going, why do I want to play 8-bit games when I can go play 8-bit games on my computer? Why do I want a box that sits on top of another box that I've got 8 of, like the NES and the SNES Classic? Nostalgia is nostalgia, and the trip is there. But the problem is that you look at these kind of things, you're like, it's going to be based on the Linux operating system. It's got a full access to an underlying OS. It has a custom interface. It's got HDMI out, USB, and SD card sockets for both classic and current games. Like, that sounds super ambitious. And it also seems like it is super open for somebody to just crack that box and throw whatever they want onto it. It's basically a portable Linux box, and all you have to do is just turn it into whatever you want, which, if that's the case, then why aren't we not just using PCs? Because at this point, there's reasons why people only play the NES and Super NES Classic. It's because of the nostalgia. It's because of the games that came with it. Not so much that you're basically giving us a cheaper version of what I would assume was just a Steam OS box.
Well, that, and we can also rip our games very easily, or put more games on the systems very easily for the NES and SNES Classics. Whereas, like, who also wants to waste the time of trying to like debug and hack into an Atari box or a Steam Link or whatever just to play more games?
It almost, now that I'm thinking about it, it almost seems like they wanted to make a Steam machine back when that was a thing, and that they were going to get in on it, but now it's that fell apart, and they were left with the plans and went, oh, do we still make one?
Yeah, speaking of Steam machines, like, yeah, that took off, didn't it? Really well.
I mean, I think their heart was in the right place, it's just the execution. I get the idea of wanting to make a more affordable PC, it's more console-like, but yeah, to get back to the idea of the Atari box, I mean, it's also bizarre, too, because one of the selling points is having access to a huge back catalog of all the Atari games, but at the same time, they just released the Atari Vault on Steam, which is just the collection of all those Atari games. And I mean, it's a potentially $300 box for access to the Atari back catalog, which is probably worth like what, $20-$30 maybe. I mean, people worked on those games, and at the time those were groundbreaking because we didn't know what video games were yet, but now...
This to me feels like it's a grab. It's just a grab. That's all it really is for them. I mean, my biggest thing about this, though, is like this really feels a lot more like... they had the idea of what they were trying to do with the Jaguar, and then they put out that giant controller that's the same size as a tablet computer. They decided, hey, we're just going to sell software. We're just going to stick our name on games. Well, most of those franchises got sold off to other companies. I mean, Bandai Namco doesn't even have anything to do with Atari anymore. That's the reason why they're the ones with the Dragon Ball Z franchise instead of Atari. There's a reason why no one cares about this. It's antiquated. It's like saying, hey, I got this great idea. We're going to put a TurboGrafx 16 and then we're going to slap a disc on it and make it so that everybody else gets CDs just like that. It's like, hey, Sega's doing it. Let's make it for the TurboGrafx. Hey, that's a great idea. Let's make that for the Jaguar. Oh, hey, that's a great idea. Let's make this thing called the 3DO. What the hell was that thing supposed to be? I mean, everything was basically the same idea. Someone's taking the technology that everyone thinks is popular and is trying to cash grab on it. And they're not doing it in a very intelligent, and they're not doing it in a very quick manner. Because in a case like this, if you're going to dev a brand new console that's a box, like the SNES Classic or the NES Classic, like, at this point, the hype is so gone that all you're doing is trying to, grappling hook onto the back of the train and hope you don't get ran across the stupid tracks for half a mile.
Yeah,
and I mean, not only that, like the main thing that's kind of frustrating about all of this is Atari is a brand at this point that is most notable if you're going to attempt to release a nostalgia console that is most notable for stuff that was made in the late 70s/early 80s. Nobody is particularly jonesing for retreaded Lynx games.
Oh, because I want to go back and play E.T. Let's do that for $300.
No,
this
that'll
seems
never
like
be
a
in
really
there.
good idea, right? Come on, everyone wants to do that again. I'm gonna.
Well, not only that, like they
Pitfall.
couldn't even put E.T. or Indiana Jones on there for like the novelty of saying play two of the worst video games ever made because like Disney owns those licenses at this point and isn't going to let them publish that.
Oh, look, we're going to let you re-murder the franchises that are so beloved again because, you know, that giant debacle about you dumping all of the carts in New Mexico wasn't already a bad enough an idea.
Yeah, so like they're not going to allow those games to even be published at this point. So it's like nobody's jonesing for Lynx games to be brought back to the forefront. Nobody is jonesing for Jaguar games, especially because all of the notable Jaguar games are games Atari didn't even develop in the first place. Like, one of the most notable games for the Jaguar is its version of Doom. Yeah, but that's not an Atari game, so that's not going to appear on this platform.
No.
So, you're talking about, from a nostalgia box perspective, the games that anybody gives a single solitary fuck about are going to be from the 70s, from the 80s. And the modern stuff, Atari doesn't even own its own license for a lot of that anymore. Like, they can't put their test drive games onto this box because they sold that brand.
They can't do the Matrix games.
Mm-hmm. Well, those were licensed from both the whatever the Wachowskis distribution group is from the movies, and from Sega, or whoever owns the digital distribution rights at this point.
Isn't
it's like none of the stuff.
I think it was Warner Brothers.
Warner Brothers, yeah.
Yeah, but isn't Cryptic supposed to have a hand in that somewhere too?
God.
Somewhere. Enter the Matrix is sitting right over there. I can check it, but I don't really want to move.
That one's published by Sega, I know, but they can't publish any of their licensed games at this point.
Yeah,
like that. I mean, they're all just dead. The DBZ games dead. The Matrix games dead. You can't touch any of that. But I'm talking about their in-house owned games, like Test Drive and so on. They can't even release those games because they sold them off to other people. So it's
what?
Half your library is just gone.
So that leaves us with what? Baseball and Pitfall? Ooh, I'm going to spend $300 for that.
Pong.
Yeah, and like the Alone in the Dark games, and it's
Pong. Oh.
So from a nostalgia box perspective, it's DOA. From a game playing box for your PC, okay, but any other platform that has already tried to do that has pretty much bombed. Like, the Steam box is not a thing anybody gives a shit about as a concept at this point.
The only good thing to come out of that was the Steam Link, and I don't even know how many people have that, aside from me.
Right. And then, of course, there's the Ouya, which nobody remembers at this
or cares about.
Yeah, so it's...
Oh, look, it's a Square Android box that I have, 4 different ways to play without
It's literally just it's just a little Pi computer, retro Pi in a little box. That's all.
Yeah, it's a Pi. Yeah,
why? And it's just the question of why do you need $300 for this? What is this going to do that I can't already get? It's going to have the Atari name on it. Eat shit from a butt. That's nobody cares. Nobody cares.
Yep. Nope, not one.
They also said they would bring in third-party games too, but I mean, you're looking at games like Minecraft and Terraria, games that are on every system already. But
so they're already selling their soul off to Microsoft. So I think that's the way to go.
You're not going to get the AAA games too. I think they already mentioned that. But yeah, it's just a very bizarre thing where you look at it and go, who is the market for this? I'm not sure it exists. And if even so, there's probably something better to get in place of it. So, I mean, there is. You could just get a PS4 or a Switch or an Xbox, and
or pretty much
download it on Steam.
Yeah,
that too.
So, aside from the fact that Atari doesn't know what the fuck it's doing, as you mentioned, Jan,
somehow it's profitable.
Yeah, go figure. But somehow they went around and decided to go and make their own cryptocurrency and cryptocurrency is something I'm still, trying to familiarize myself with over the past year. I assume Bitcoin is one of those, right? Or am I thinking, or is that completely
No,
different?
you're
That
right.
is cryptocurrency,
Yeah,
yes.
cryptocurrency
Okay.
is Bitcoin, yes.
So
It's nothing unless you believe it is something.
Yeah. So what is the point of even making your own cryptocurrency? I mean, how does that exactly work?
This is my wheelhouse. All right.
Mark, please.
So, Bitcoin was kind of a thing that was created a while ago as a decentralized currency that wasn't really owned or operated or maintained by anybody. Two groups of people think this is the best idea. The first group are people who are kind of anti-government nut jobs. And I want to be clear, most of the people who are looking at this as a decentralized currency are anti-government, yes, like they don't want the government involved in their stuff, but a lot of the people who are really invested in Bitcoin as a thing are the nut job factions. So it's the anti-government nut jobs who don't want the government involved in their currency. They don't want the government involved in their life. They're kind of sort of the off-the-grid weirdos, which whatever. But then the other side is, well, criminals. So you have this deregulated this unregulated, decentralized currency that everybody owns and nobody owns at the same time. And it's kind of a case where the main people who are investing in it in the beginning was the people who absolutely did not want the government associated with them in any form or fashion, whether it be because they were paranoid or because they were doing bad things. Flash forward a few years, and Bitcoin has become kind of a big deal. And, like, there's money in it. There's constant bottoming out and regrowth, bottoming out and regrowth, bottoming out and regrowth, because the vast majority of the money that's coming into it is people who are buying it with the express intention of selling it. Speculators, investors, things like that. People are treating Bitcoin like the stock market in a lot of cases.
I was just about to say, it sounds like it's just turning into its own form of the stock exchange.
Right. Mm-hmm. The problem is that whenever somebody comes up with an idea that can make money, what happens is that one person does all of the work to make the default version of it, and then a whole bunch of other assholes show up and do their me too version of it that might be better, but are probably worse, and are just there because they're fucking grifters who just want to make a buck off of people by attempting to get in on the ground floor of an idea. And we see this in every industry. In video games, it was, well, we came out with Doom. Oh, here's every shitty first-person shooter knockoff ever. DDR came out. Oh, here's DDR, but with diagonals now. Shit like that. In the world of streaming, Netflix came up with the streaming platform, and now everybody's trying to undercut that to the point where there's like 15 different streaming platforms. YouTube, who is also trying to undercut the streaming platform, comes up with, the video service, and then you've got every single video hosting service out there trying to be the next YouTube, to the point where now Twitch is trying to be the next YouTube. Twitch does video game streaming, and then everybody decides to do video game streaming. The point is, you come up with an idea, it's successful, 80 gajillion assholes also want to do it. So that's where we are now. Bitcoin itself has essentially kind of bottomed the fuck out, because all of the speculators sold off, and it's just at its rock bottom, presumably. It may come back, it may not. That's not really my particular point of concern. But a whole bunch of other people are also trying to create cryptocurrencies in the wake of Bitcoin becoming a big deal. And the problem is that Bitcoin itself is at least sort of backed up by something, which is like the blockchain decryption methodology. A lot of these other cryptocurrencies are basically just backed up by fucking hopes and dreams, more or less. And it's just grifters trying to get in on a quote-unquote cryptocurrency so that they can take their money and run. I'm not saying Atari's doing that necessarily, but I am saying that we have no idea what their end game is at this point.
All right, so
So,
what are
do
they
you
planning
want-
on doing with this cryptocurrency of theirs, Atari?
Okay, so they mentioned plans about it back in December, and this is the first time they're actually expanding on it. So they're teaming up with another company to make it a thing, which is it's kind of what they've been doing with a lot of their stuff. They just find another company to work with on it and make it a thing. This is called blockchain, and what they're going to do is the currency will be dubbed the Atari token, and it will be used in a lot of their online casino games as the currency used to gamble with. So my guess is you throw real money to get Atari tokens, and that's what you use in game. I don't know how that's going to work exactly. That's going to have to wait to see how they pull that one off, my guess will be a while. A lot of this stuff just came from the press release where, Chesney just gave the generic statement about how it's going to work and how it'll benefit the company. According to the Bloomberg article I found leading up to the show, their shares jumped 60% after they announced it. So that was probably a good day for them.
So pretty much there's really nothing really significant going on in regards to the cryptocurrency. It's just, hey, we've got something. We're going to partner with somebody. This is going to be a thing.
I mean, unless you play one of their casino games, I can't see this as being something you would worry about otherwise. It just seems like it's going to be a minor change to some of their games, and I don't know if it's going to have any use outside of it, or outside of them.
Well, the thing is that cryptocurrency in general doesn't necessarily have a lot of use. Generally speaking, a lot of people, there's two ways that you can get most cryptocurrencies. The first is, because all cryptocurrency is based off of the blockchain method. It's essentially mining data, like mining information out of the blockchain, verifying information from the blockchain, et cetera, so on. There are two ways that you can get money. The first is to transform your real money into digital currency, into the cryptocurrency, through some type of an investment service. The second method is by actually mining for it yourself, which usually involves having some type of a machine that can decrypt blockchain and get data from it.
Okay. Now.
Okay, so just quick correction. Yeah, I blockchain is just. Can you clarify what blockchain is, Mark? Because I think I messed that up.
No, it's fine. The simplest way that I can define blockchain is it's data, essentially. It's records. So what happens is how blockchain works is it's literally just a chain of blocks. So that's why that term is used. You can think of it as, like, the simplest way to think about it as if you open up, like, say, an Excel document and you start putting stuff into the cells. You could imagine each cell in an Excel document as a block. It's literally just a record of data. In blockchain, everything that is linked together is linked together cryptographically. That is, like, it's linked together using some type of security measure that obfuscates the data inside of it. So when you're using blockchain, what usually happens there is that people go through and they verify that data to make sure that it is the way that it's supposed to be, that it is what it says it is. That's how Bitcoin mining works. You go through and you verify data on the blockchain, and eventually you will find unmined data, which in turn gets you cryptocurrency.
Okay.
All right.
Yeah, but the company that handles their casino games is called Paraplay. It's a Paris-based company, so that was actually a company. Blockchain. I remember blockchain from the article, and I think I just misunderstood what that meant. So thanks, Mark.
Okay. So moving things along back to Atari, and just to quickly wrap it up so we can get on with the show. Does anybody even think at this point that it's a good idea for what Atari is attempting to do with going into two different types of business practices right here, both with what they're trying to do with a roller coaster tycoon, and trying to continue pressing on with the Atari box, and then trying to create this cryptocurrency. We'll start with you, Mark.
Depends on what they want to do with it. If Atari is attempting to be a legitimate organization, a legitimate company that is attempting to, for lack of a better way of explaining it, if they are attempting to be an actual, an actual proper corporation, no, absolutely not. It's going to blow up in their face. It's going to be horrible, and it's going to go completely to shit. If their intention is to just grift on people's money and make whatever amount of, cash they can, absolutely it's a great idea, because they're going to get money involved from, the stock sales and things of that nature. The major problem here is Atari is, again, they have publicly traded stock. So it's the idea of them attempting to grift people out of money is difficult to fathom and believe. So I have to assume that they are doing this with the legit intention of this being like good business practice. If that's the case, no, it's going to fucking blow up in their face. It's going to be a terrible goddamn idea, and it's going to put them even further in the hole than they already are.
All right, your thoughts, Jan?
I think that in the idea of trying to make it for doing Roller Coaster Tycoon for the Switch, I think is probably not a bad idea. Roller Coaster Tycoon is still a very popular franchise. It still has a fairly sizable user base, and putting it on an actual mobile console that's outside of, Android or iOS devices, which, let's be honest, aren't exactly the biggest screens unless you're going to try to put it on a tablet. And then again, why would you worry about it? If you're going to be taking a Switch somewhere, you might as well try to put some games on it that you actually want to enjoy. Roller Coaster Tycoon is a nice time killer. You'll be able to put some stuff together, touch a few things here and there, get a few things built up, and then go play another game while that's building in the background. It's the same thing as you do it on the Android or the iOS versions of it. You're just going to go in, make some modifications, go out and check your other games. I do it. Mark does it. We play our mobile games all the time. So it's like, to me, it makes sense as an idle idea in the background. But if that's what they're going for, great. If they want it to be this big, popular reinventing of the franchise, which doesn't sound like it is, because it looks like it's basically just a modified, updated port, I really don't think they're going to do much more with that. If they're going to try to release a console, though, if they're going to try to go into this cryptocurrency stuff, it sounds like to me they're just reaching. At this point, it sounds like you got a bunch of 70-year-old board members in some sort of a back office looking at the internet and basically going, that looks like a thing we should do. So does that. Everybody, go put your resources into these things. This is popular with the kids these days. This is what we should be doing, too. Like I said earlier, to me, it feels like a cash grab, and to me, it feels like all they're trying to do is get onto a train way later than everyone else at the very back end of it, and all they're trying to do is to not fall off the back end and basically go, look, guys, we're still relevant.
You know what else is popular with the kids these days? Eating Tide Pods. Anyway.
We are not talking about Tide Pods. I'm not even going to get there. Yeah. Let's move on.
And your final thoughts, Nick, before we move on to the next topic.
Yeah, so, the Roller Coaster Tycoon thing, I don't think it's a bad idea at all, just because, I had friends growing up that loved that game, and, I'm sure it still has its fans out there, and, there are the mobile games now that I'm sure are getting played a bunch, so getting it on the Switch, yeah, go for it. And it appears the Start Engine campaign, the minimum goal was $10,000. It reached it. It has $47 and some change right now with 63 days left. So it looks like it's going to happen. And even then, there's a Polygon article that goes into great detail about how this whole thing is going to work for Atari. I'll drop the link in the chat in a second. But the CEO said that the game was going to happen either way. It's just the Start Engine campaign is a way for the company to just find an easier way to fund their games with minimal risk. The Atari box, that Indiegogo campaign was supposed to launch a long time ago. I don't know what's going on with it because you can go to the page, it's live, but you can't do anything with it. All you can do is sign up for the newsletter to get the notification for when it goes live. So we're coming up on what's supposed to be the initial release window. Expecting word about the delay any day now, if it happens at all. I'm starting to have my doubts. We'll say this though, I kind of like the look of the box itself from what they've shown. It looks kind of cool.
I mean, it's sleek. I'm not gonna lie, but it's like
it's sleek and it's got
everything else.
I appreciate.
So was the Ouya.
Yeah, but the Ouya didn't have wooden panels, so.
Oh, sorry.
I'm sorry. Yeah, I want that good
So what you're
classic late
saying
70s vibe.
So what you're saying is it's basically the minivan of consoles.
Sure.
Or
Gotcha.
or the mom and dad station wagon.
Whoever designed that console knows where it's coming from, so I appreciate that little touch. That's a nice aesthetic touch, I thought at least. Yeah, there's just researching what Atari's been doing the past few years. Again, according to this Polygon article, which I think was a pretty good read, but there's just something that's off about the whole thing where apparently the company is profitable, but I look at it and go, I'm not sure how. I guess the mobile gaming space is really keeping them afloat, but I don't know. There's just something off that I can't really put my finger on there. It just seems like the people running the company carry the Atari name with more nostalgic weight than it actually has. And I guess that's the root of it.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, thank you guys so much. We dug deep into, making this topic what was going to be like a small...
weird, man.
It is. It was a small conversation that somehow grew into this really huge discussion, all because of a little bit of research that made the issues look that much bigger. So we did do a company name drop earlier in the program, and that of course is 3DO. They are the next topic of conversation here, and it's more of a retrospective and talking about whether something they did was a good idea, bad idea, and I'll start it off. So 3DO is a company that was founded by Trip Hawkins, former founder and CEO of Electronic Arts from the 90s. He left EA around about 1991. He founded the 3DO company, as it was actually called, and he had ambitions of starting his own video game console, which became the 3DO. Kind of almost reminds you of back in the day in the 80s when everyone referred to the Nintendo system or Sega Master System as, oh, go play your Nintendo, like, the ignorant bullcrap. So, having 3DO as the name of your console is kind of weird, especially when your company's name is 3DO. But anyway, yeah, so moving on, they decide they want to do something completely different with the way they market the 3DO. They decided to license it out to multiple video game companies. Some of them is Gold, Panasonic, and I forget what the other name of the company is that they licensed it out to. I think there was a total of...
There was 7. So it was LG, Matsuhita, which is also now Panasonic, AT&T, MCA, Time Warner, and EA.
Yeah. They licensed out their system out to that many people, and they thought it would lead to a better profit margin being able to license the hardware out to all these people. The system launched in 1993 for the low price of $6.99. Ooh, that was a bargain, wasn't it? They did have a lot of backing for the system, though. They did have Electronic Arts backing them up. They had a couple of others, like... trying to think of... I thought I had a list here of other companies that backed them up. Yeah, screw it. I'm not going to look for it right now. But they had... The concept of the system, if you look at it, was a loading bay multimedia system. The most common one to find was, of course, the one that was put out by Panasonic, and they had 2 models of which they made. The system had a loading bay, or open top CD drive. It had a controller that was modeled after the 3-button Sega Genesis controller, and only had one controller port. However, you can daisy chain the controllers together by plugging them into each other. That was a dumb idea.
Oh my god!
I own a 3DO too, and I tried playing a multiplayer game. It also acted as it was supposed to be a multimedia system, so you could play VCDs on it, regular CDs on it. They were really just trying to be ahead of the curve back in 1993 with this system. They had competitors at the time like the Philips CDI, and I guess what was the name? God damn it! Why am I drawing a blank here? The name of the big disc.
Laserdisc.
Laserdiscs. They were competing with them at the same time, so it was like 3DO was literally like trying to be the all-in-one box that Microsoft tried to make the Xbox One today. Games, videos, music. However, despite the fact that it had decent support and had some okay games, the problem was they went up against 3 of their major competitors, which was Sega, Nintendo, and now newcomer Sony. Also, somewhere mixed in there at the same time, back in 1993, you had the Amiga CD32. I think the Philips CDI came out around the same time, and the Atari Jaguar, I think, came out a year later, or did it come out in 1993? I forget.
I think it came out a year later, but
I think it was 94.
94, yeah. So, like, within the span of 2 years, from 93 to 95, with the new generation of consoles coming out, you had literally a clusterfuck of competition right there. You had the big 3, and then you had everybody else in the very bottom of the fighting for scraps, pretty much. And 3DO was not really in a good place for that. So I'm going to start handing this off over to you guys, starting with you, Mark. Where did 3DO go wrong with the way they tried to market the system? And what could they have done better in order to like stand out above, to be able to compete with Nintendo, Sony, and Sega?
Well, I mean, like, attempting to follow SNK's business model of we have a good product, people will pay money for it no matter how much it costs, is never going to be a particularly viable business practice, especially because there just wasn't really any long-term value in it for the consumer. Like the Neo Geo, as a platform, mostly existed for as long as it did because people were also using it for arcade machine purposes. So you would get the Neo Geo with like the multiple bay cartridge slot add-on device, and you would use that for the arcade machines that would have like 6 games in one. And that continued to be a consumer product for years and years and years, despite the fact that like nobody you knew owned one, because it was something that could be applied to the arcade scene. Yeah, the 3DO was never going to be able to cash in on that. So if you are going to charge an exorbitantly large amount of money for your platform, it needs to have something on it nobody else has to offer. And a lot of it. Like, the most expensive console has never been the winner in console gaming's in console gaming cycles, in console gaming's generations. Nobody buys the most expensive one. They generally buy the one that's the first, that has some games on it that they want to play, that is reasonably priced. So coming out of the gate with no brand name associated that anybody cares about, no games associated that anybody cares about, at an extremely high price point, nobody's going to give a shit about this. Being on like the bleeding edge of technology has never helped anybody, with the possible exception of Sony's PlayStation 2 and having a DVD drive. Like, nobody else has ever cared. Having a Blu-ray drive never mattered for the PlayStation 3. Having a CD drive never mattered for the Sega CD. It's it was just a comedy of errors. There's no one thing 3DO could have fixed to magically be viable in that marketplace. It would have required a complete restructuring of what they did in the consumer marketplace, top to bottom, soup to nuts, to be anything worthwhile.
Okay, well, I think there could have been one thing that they could have fixed that might have helped them out in the long run, and this question's going to appeal to you, Jan, right here. 3DO, released or licensed out their product to 7 different companies, so we had 7 different models of the 3DO. Do you think in the long run this really hurt them and caused more confusion amongst consumers than anything else? Like, they didn't know which version of the system would be better than the other, even though it was technically the same hardware across the board. Do you think this would have helped them out, at least in some regard, if they just consolidated it into one console?
I think maybe, but I think the other part of this also sort of goes back to the idea of basically what the whole title of this entire section that we're talking about is the 3DO, or how EA kills everything.
Uh-oh, we lost Jan.
Back in a minute.
I love. Yeah.
Right.
Anyway, so like I was saying, it's basically how 3DO or how EA kills everything. Basically, the idea was that they were going to market these consoles between all of these different manufacturers, except for the fact that, yeah, basically it looked like a giant VCR. Especially the Panasonic one. If you look at a picture of the original Panasonic 3DO, it was basically a VCR. The front panel of it, where the CD tray was, it looked like you could just stick a VHS tape in there.
Yeah, I have that model.
The thing about it is that they had a really great
No! Jan, come back!
concept where it. This is why I hate Skype so much. We really need to fix that.
Yeah, we didn't get around to testing Discord, so we'll get on that soon.
Anyway, baseline is 3DO had a really interesting concept because at its core, it was a CD-based system, which was something that was a little bit more ahead of its time, considering the fact that its 2 major console competitors were the Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis. The fact that this basically was the same price as both of those consoles combined really didn't help its anything. Knowing, though, that you had multiple companies working on the same console at the same time, why didn't they just try to market each individual console to a different platform? It doesn't make a lot of sense to me. Well, in the long run, it wasn't more about what the console provided, more along the lines of that they had 2 major game franchises that came out in the long run that made a hell of a lot more money for them versus the actual hardware itself. And I mean, that really puts to me the idea of, you make it further in, you've got, and I'm pretty sure that I'm saying this in basically anyone who knows anything about gaming. There are 2 games that 3DO helped to either develop or publish in some fashion that to this day hold massive roots in games, so much so that you say these names, you know what I'm talking about. And that's Heroes of Might and Magic series and Meridian 59.
One of the oldest and somehow still alive MMORPGs on the planet.
One of the very first. It's still in the hands of its original game developers, so that's probably part of the reason for it, is they still care about it. They still want it to, survive. Still not sure how RuneScape's doing it either, but that's beside the point. But when you really look at it, how they're like, 4 years down the road, we're going to make another generation of the console. We're going to call it the M2, and they sold it to Matsuhita for $100 million. They finally broke a profit at 1.2 million over the second half of 96. They're like, fuck it, we're not going to worry about consoles anymore, we're just going to dedicate ourselves to the software. And I think you're going to see other companies at the exact same thing, that where Atari did it, Sega did it. It makes sense that eventually you get to a point where you saw where the market was going, and they understood that. They're like, even if we had 9 consoles, we could have had 50 console versions. It wouldn't have mattered. The console was doomed because we just didn't think about what was more important, the hardware or the software. And those companies have done the exact same thing. Let's just focus on the software going forward because that's what's making us money.
And I do want to note that I think that the way that Panasonic, or the 3DO brand in particular, but the Panasonic version of it specific as compared to all of the other versions, kind of answers the question that people keep having of why are consoles proprietary? Because, like, you see that conversation come up kind of all the time at this point, where people are like, oh, why don't we just have one universal console? And, like, what's the point of doing this, that, and the other thing? Why is there exclusivity? Why don't we just make all the consoles work with one another? And I think the 3DO brand kind of answers that question in a lot of cases.
Exactly.
It's everybody wants their consoles to be the PC marketplace. I just go out and I buy whatever console, and then I just play it. And game consoles don't really work that way. People don't want to have to research about their console before they go out and buy it. Like, what's it going to be compatible with? What's it not going to be compatible with? What's it going to do? What's it not going to do? There's going to be instances where this console is going to be squeezed out of the marketplace. If there's 8 different people making the 3DO, but the Panasonic version is the only one that people really remember, because all of those other versions basically never made any kind of significant dent in the marketplace. You're eventually going to end up where there's going to be 1 or 2 people selling those consoles anyway, and the rest are going to get squeezed out, or they're not going to be any good, or whatever. It's a neat idea, but it doesn't have any real practical value at this point, just because you can't enforce quality standards if you want to have people involved. Like, sooner or later you're going to have to either insist that they make it a certain way, or you're going to have to let them just kind of bone up your platform. It's not a great way to do console gaming. As much as it sucks having these semi-exclusive platforms and not being able to play with your friends because they bought a different system from you or whatever, having a Sony and a Microsoft and a Nintendo all make the game box, and it's the same basic platform but to their own specifications, would be 100 times worse.
So yes, it's a green screen. I just got distracted by that question. What were you going to say, Jen?
In that vein, though, I think the 3DO itself as a console probably could have survived a lot longer than its cycle. I would assume until at least the N64 or the Dreamcast at some point was basically, if they'd had let all of those other companies come together to make one console. In a case like this, instead of having each person make their own console, which had its own quirks and failures, trying to put all of that technology together. If we've got some, who did we have in here? You've got LG and Panasonic, that's hardware. AT&T, they could have put in some sort of, digital communications aspect to it. Time Warner and EA, that's software. MCA, I mean, that's music, You've got the ability to put in quality, hardware that could give you all kinds of decent soundtracks, or the ability to store or even download music from your AT&T connection. Something like this was like a dream come true, but then they just were like, now everybody go do what you want. And it's like, this was a bad idea. I mean, that's a dream team of companies to try to come together to make one console. And if you try to put all of those different companies on their own version instead of one version, it would have just ended up a lot better. I mean, and especially since you've got 3 really powerful games, 3 really powerful franchises that were either developed or published by your company, it makes sense to me that this is something that you could really put out to the masses and have it be something that could be a far greater system.
Now, of course, the system failed, but 3DO was at least going to try and trudge on for a little bit. They had in development a second console called the M2, which unfortunately amounted to nothing because 3DO started to change their focus. Like you said, they started going towards more the console and PC publishing sort of side of things. They brought out Meridian as their first MMORPG. They started the Army Man games, which were published on the PlayStation and PlayStation 2. And they eventually just gave up on the M2 projects. I believe they sold everything M2 related to Matsushita, which
to
was
Panasonic, yeah.
Yeah.
And Panasonic ended up basically scrapping that entire project, but they used the research that they did to put the chipset into various vending type machines like ATMs, coffee machines, stuff like that. It was really weird.
It is weird. So 3DO has eventually became a third-party publisher, but that didn't eventually last for them because the company eventually went under in 2003, a couple years after the release of the PlayStation 2 in the North American market. Or wait, was it the 2000 or 2001 that it came out in the United States?
2000. End of 2000.
All right, about 4 years after the release of the PlayStation 2, which is pretty much when their franchise is starting to go stale. People didn't really care much about their Army Men games because, well, let's be honest, you can only release the same game so many times. Oh yeah. I mean, but theirs was stale from the beginning. The Army Men games. They did have, of course, they did release some games for the Nintendo 64, which was the Battle Tank games, which I remember having a lot of fun with. I'm trying to look here. They had that baseball game that you really liked, High Heat Major League Baseball, Nick.
I didn't like it, but yeah, they made those games. The problem was, no. Here's the thing: I knew about those games, but I never played them because here's High Heat Baseball, but also here's World Series Baseball, which has the ESPN presentation and the better graphics. So why would I want that game when I could have the cooler looking game? I mean, what game's going to appeal more to the 10, 11-year-old at the time?
Yeah, and
this
of course,
game or the game that's got ESPN in it.
And of course, they had their biggest franchise, which was the Might and Magic and the Heroes of Might and Magic franchise, which you mentioned earlier, Jan. Mm-hmm. So at some point, the company had to kick the bucket. Let's see here. As a third-party developer, I'm trying to figure out.
Also, MVP Baseball was a really good baseball game too, so they had to compete with that.
That's true.
That is true. They
so
had to
it was
compete
around
with a lot of people.
He ended up filing for Chapter 11. I think it was in May of 2003.
Mm-hmm.
And at that point, they laid off a bunch of dudes. They didn't pay them for it because what are they going to do? They sold off a bunch of their IPs to Microsoft, Namco, Crave, Ubisoft. It was around that point. I mean, think about what was going on in 96 to 2003. I mean, we're looking at still a really solid PC series of games. The Super Nintendo and the PlayStation 1 are still things. And it's the same year, 96 is the same year that the Nintendo 64 came out. Sega's got its Saturn console, which is doing fantastically well as a disc-based system in Japan. Well, maybe not so much in the States, but you're looking at a lot of stuff that started hitting around that time frame. Mm-hmm. Jump forward to 2003 when everything's going sideways for the company. You've got people selling, people merging.
Yeah. In fact, as a matter of fact, the early 2000s, I would say pretty much during the entire PlayStation 2, Xbox, and GameCube era, there was a bunch of things going on. You had, like you said, companies merging. We had Square and Enix. They merged. Yep. That was the big one. You had Namco and Bandai merged together. Mm-hmm. Sega got bought by Sammy. You had a lot of the pretty much the landscape of the gaming company or the landscape was just changing for companies all over the place, and you were either closing up shop like 3DO did, or you were being bought by a bigger property like Atari was by Infogrames, which we mentioned earlier. So it was They just couldn't, I guess, adapt to the atmosphere that was going on at the time.
Exactly. Well, I mean, another really big one too was Valve was basically releasing its first stable version of Steam back in 2003. So once again, you've got all of these big name companies that you've never really heard of, just like 3DO, who are doing far better and far bigger than anything that Panasonic 3DO had even thought about being able to put together. And here it is now that you've got all of these other major companies that are buying out and merging, and it's getting to a point where now you're just like, well, what are we going to do? Software it is.
Now,
well, I mean, it comes down to a case of a lot of companies were not prepared for the transition from what gaming was in the 80s and the early 90s into what gaming became in the mid to late 90s and beyond. Like, a lot of companies, as was noted, ultimately end up being merged into other companies because they just couldn't compete. On top of like what you guys have mentioned with Square Enix and so on, like, Sierra ended up merging into Vivendi and then ended up being merged into Activision Blizzard and so on and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
Like, again, Activision and Blizzard are all part of like one big amalgamation at this point. It's ridiculous. So it's a lot of these companies were just not prepared, and you either needed to merge or you were just going to die off. The bigger problem, I think, is that outside of the Heroes and Might and Magic games, the 3DO company was not releasing anything anybody gave a shit about. Like, the Army Men games were fine in the beginning. Towards the end of their corporate cycle, nobody cared about the Army Men games. Nobody cared about Sarge. Nobody cared about the lady from Portal Runner. Nobody cared about any of that. Like, most people did not play those games. How many people do you know own Go Die Elemental Force? I do, because it's bad. But like, how many people do you know who played that outside of like, people like me who are like, ooh, terrible games.
Ooh.
Nobody gives a shit about that. And that's the thing, is you specifically have a platform at this point. You specifically are a publisher who is trying to survive on your own. You need games people want to play. And they just didn't have it. They didn't have anything anybody gave a damn about. They were not making good games. And that's going to be a lot of the end results of these conversations, is that eventually it comes down to, oh, well, these companies had like name brands that were worthwhile, but they just weren't making games anybody cared about, because a lot of those games just weren't good.
Okay, so here's a question. I'll give this one to Nick because you were practically born when the system came out, so...
Yeah, can I just bring up a few things that weren't really mentioned, though?
Yeah, sure, go ahead, and then I'll ask my question.
Yeah, so, I mean, Janice mentioned already that there were a bunch of different manufacturers for the actual system and different iterations of it. That was actually a big reason why it cost so much, because 3DO itself wasn't making the console. It was Panasonic at first, and Panasonic had to turn a profit. So since Panasonic couldn't make a profit off the games, they had to do it on the system itself. So that's why it originally cost $700.
That was one thing that always really frustrated the hell out of me as a concept. Like, Sony had their own internal R&D group, so they were able to just make their own console, and they could just handle the research, they could just handle the development, they could just handle the release, etc. But with Panasonic, you would think that wouldn't be a problem. But yeah, if they're trying to sell something at a profit and they don't own the actual, like the actual license associated, all they're making money from is that hardware.
Mm-hmm.
So
that's a really shitty business model.
Yeah, and Trip Hawkins, just in a bunch of post-mortem stuff afterwards, there's articles where he was interviewed about. He even said that was a mistake, where it really should have been just one business handling everything as far as making the console goes from the start. Another thing too was, I mean, just by looking back on stuff, apparently this thing was a pain in the ass to make games for, which is why its launch was kind of botched, because there were a lot of games that were supposed to be out at launch but were delayed, and it seemed like there were manufacturing issues too as far as supplying retailers with the system from the get-go. I mean, you guys were around at the time, so you would probably be able to speak better for it than I could, but do you remember hearing anything like that? Or anything similar?
I never heard anything so much about it being hard to make games for, because that really went straight to the Sega Saturn. Because people were bitching about how the architecture of the Sega Saturn was just such a pain in the ass that made it very hard to even go so far as make fully functional 3D modeled games. 3DO, on the other hand, with their console, I would say it wasn't as difficult to program for, because some people were able to make ports easily for the game. I mean, you had a lot of games that were on the Saturn, the PlayStation, and on the 3DO. Games pretty much like the Road Rage series, the very first Need for Speed, Gex, Pode, trying to think of that.
Sir.
Pode, whatever. Pode.
Pode.
Okay. Pode.
Oh.
I prefer saying it Pode because it's a stupid game and a stupid title. It just seemed like that it had another major issue going for it, which was the lack of exclusive games for it. And pretty much any exclusive games that it did have were either canceled or they were published on other consoles after the death of the system, pretty much. So 3DO was pretty much just shooting themselves in the foot from the get-go.
Yeah, I guess it was just a matter of getting familiar with the technology. So I'm not sure what the dev cycle was like leading up to launch.
The main issue between the Saturn and the 3DO, as far as the actual manufacturing of video games for it, was the architecture of the actual Saturn. The programming that had to go into what they were making for the Saturn was far more difficult because it was a newer version of the technology than what they were doing with the 3DO and the CDI and the Sega CD and the 32X. All of these games that were coming out in these higher resolution, higher polygon count style of systems weren't really able to catch up to what the Saturn was doing. The Saturn was well ahead of its time. So was the Dreamcast. Both of these systems that Sega released were so far ahead of their time that they have games. I mean, for Christ's sakes, they're still making games for the Saturn and Dreamcast in Japan. Like, if you don't look it up, you don't know it, but it's the truth. Like, they are still companies that make games, retro games, specifically for those consoles, because they're only still trying to, like, basically say this console, even though it never made it in the States, still has a life in Japan, to a point where there's still enough people making games for it. They're still only hitting 80 to 90% of the actual technology's limitation because of the way the architecture of those systems work. So when the 3DO came out, it was like, oh, this is so much easier.
Mm-hmm. Now, interesting little fact, the port of Doom for the 3DO only took 10 weeks, and it was done by one person. And I almost got a chance to have her on our show last year, but she never replied back to me after we shot some emails back and forth. She said she pretty much had a 10-week deadline to try and port Doom to the system. So she did all the programming. That's all she had. 10 weeks, and what you got is what you got. It was a crappy game, but you know what? One person in 10 weeks, I would say that's, pretty valiant.
I hope she got one hell of a bonus after that.
I think she got screwed over, if I recall.
Pretty
reading
sure
the
she's
story.
probably one of those people that got fired without pay once they decided to file for 11.
Yeah. So.
Well, was she an employee of id, or?
No, she was an employee of a company that decided they wanted to do video games and had absolutely no knowledge or experience in the video game industry, and they just hired her to port the game over because the CEO at the time was pretty much just going around saying, oh yeah, Doom is popular, we have to have it on this system, our company has absolutely No reputation whatsoever, but we somehow secured a license to port this game over to the 3DO, so let's do it.
Oh, God bless her.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just another thing about manufacturing of the actual console being by someone else. I wonder what the coordination was like just between 3DO, the company, and then Panasonic, and then an actual third-party dev, because that might have been a confusing triangle too, for all we know. Hey, what's the specs? I don't know. Go ask Panasonic. Okay, how do we make games for this thing? I don't know. Ask 3DO. I wonder if there was any confusion like that.
I'm sure there probably could have been.
There had to have been,
lots of
because also
miscommunication.
with Panasonic, they released a upgraded model with extra RAM in the system and a kind of a BIOS that allowed you to, check on your data for your games and stuff like that.
But then Panasonic wasn't the only ones making the thing.
Nope.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah,
It's like how you.
bizarre.
It's the 3DO's build cycle was basically the same idea as trying to dev games on Android platforms. There's so many different variations of devices and so many different variations of the Android operating system that it just doesn't make a lot of sense to try to manufacture to one baseline if some of the newer phones can't handle it for some crazy reason because it requires a specific kind of graphics processor and those phones don't have it. It was the exact same idea.
All right. Well, I got one final question today. We'll go around the room with this one, and this one we'll start off with you, Nick.
So was this your question from earlier?
Yeah,
I
the
didn't
question I was
derail
going to
that,
ask.
did
Yeah, no, it's okay. It went to some good places. What do you think about somebody going out and buying the 3DO brand name and trying to bring it back as a video game publisher? Do you think that should be a good idea, bad idea? Just let it stay dead.
That the 3DO name honestly means nothing to me. I don't want to sound harsh, but yeah, you say 3DO, I'll go, oh, that thing that came out in the early 90s that was like $700, and then just leave it at that, because honestly, before tonight, I couldn't even tell you a game that came out on that system. All I knew about was that baseball game.
Yeah.
That's about it. It's
Goddamn kids.
Think about it.
We're old.
But I mean,
Mark.
think about it. You bring that name out now, you're gonna have everyone in my age range and younger going, who?
The what?
There's nothing really there. I mean, you can bring it back, be like, we're 3DO, okay, cool, and then they start putting out all these awesome games, which would be a long shot, but definitely not an impossibility. Then yeah, it's a different story, and people will be saying, oh, the new 3DO is great, but I mean, I don't think there's plans for that to happen, and I don't think it will happen.
Okay, how about you, Mark? What do you think?
Is the name even out there?
Huh?
Yeah, that's right. The 3D what now?
Is the name even out there for grabs?
It might be. Mark, same question applying to you.
I don't see any particular need to reinvent the 3DO name, to revive the 3DO name, just because, honestly, it's not a brand that anybody really misses, I don't think. Like, at least with a brand like, say, Acclaim, etc., so on, things of that nature, there was a certain amount of, things are great ish, like that there were certain specific things that were good. There were certain specific things that at least some people kind of cared about, maybe. I mean, I didn't particularly like very many of their games, but at least you can point and you can go, you know what, the Mortal Kombat port that they did was fine, the NBA Jam port that they did was fine, they brought us Psychic Force, that was, there was stuff over the long history of their existence that at least a few people will be like, yeah, okay, that's all right. For 3DO, it's like, a lot of the stuff that they are notable for, they didn't develop, and a lot of the stuff that they developed, they aren't really notable for. There's just not any particular value in reviving that brand name. It's not like an Atari where Atari was a company that at least had some historical value. 3DO was the maker of a console nobody bought and a bunch of games that nobody really cared about. It would be like trying to make, another go with the TurboGrafx brand name. You could, but why bother?
Yeah.
Why? Game cards that are basically the same size as a PCNCIA card. What?
Can I add another personal anecdote?
Sure.
Is that okay? So now that I'm thinking about it, I don't think even when they were making PS1 and PS2 games, I don't think I've ever owned a game that 3DO has had any involvement in. And quite honestly, like, I knew what the 3DO was, but if it wasn't for remember G4 and that show Cinematech they had?
Yeah,
That was a good show.
That just showed game trailers on loop, but it didn't matter what time they were from. They just showed a bunch of them in just one show and called it an episode.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, if that show didn't take 3DO trailers for games, I would have had no idea what the 3DO was as a kid. That was the only way I discovered it. Would have eventually caught on because internet, but yeah.
Oh, well, now last question is
G4
over.
teaching kids about games when the internet wasn't fully there yet.
Well,
I mean, I think the biggest condemnation against the 3DO brand at this point is nobody has tried to bring the Army Men franchise back.
Or any of their other significant franchises like Battle Tanks, or
Do you think Disney
who's the
would
company
step in
that
if they
owns
tried?
the Might and Magic franchise?
I don't remember who has it
Because
anymore.
didn't
I'd
they
have to
release a
look it
Might
up.
and Magic X on Steam a couple years ago?
That's Ubisoft did that one.
Yeah, Ubisoft.
Yeah.
Okay.
But they published
Well, that-
it. And that game
but
was
that
good.
was-
That game was good.
Right, but that was a different part of the franchise. That wasn't the Heroes of Might and Magic portion. That was just the Might and Magic franchise, which is a side of that. So
I thought the Might and Magic was just the standard franchise, and the Heroes was the
right,
side
the
expansion.
Heroes is basically a side story of the Might and Magic franchise, but the Might and Magic main games are owned by a different group that was not the same team that was working with 3DO to make the Heroes
New
of Might
World
and
Computing.
franchise. Yes.
There we go. Yeah. So anyway, yeah, just going off to
Oh.
you, Jan. Your final thoughts of a brand revival?
Look, we don't need an Atari box. We don't need another 3DO. Honestly, these companies were just old and outdated, and really the only two things that I honestly can say that the 3DO company even did that was a positive for the gaming world was the release of the Heroes of Might and Magic franchise, which still holds a lot of credibility and a lot of weight, and a lot of people know these games. And the fact that they were basically the first company to basically tell, hey, look, you got to rate your games because people are buying these games and they don't know what they're doing with it. Back in, was it March of 94, they had a guidance system that was basically four. It was E, 12, 17, and AO, basically letting you know, hey, these are games that are going to be appropriate for this age range, but they left it to the companies who made the software to actually put those ratings on the packages. This is only months before the ESRB is actually founded, which was back at that point in September of that year. So they basically gave us a very interesting starting point for what the ESRB became 8 months later, a year later, where everybody now has something on there from ESRB basically saying, this is what the game is all about. This is what the game is going to be. This is the age range we think is appropriate for you to be able to get this game. Does that mean everyone follows it? 50-50. Is it still a good thing that we have it on these games? Yes, absolutely. Because there's still going to be plenty of times where people are, if the ESRB hadn't have been made and if 3DO hadn't really paved the way for something like that, the ESRB would have been totally different.
Useless fact, by the way. The 3DO was the only console during the 90s that had porn games on the system.
Yep.
Thus, the creation of the AO rating through their little rating system.
Yep.
So,
Thanks.
thank you, 3DO.
Thank
We
you.
really
Thank
needed
you.
that. We needed porn. We really needed to play controls with one hand. Thank you. All right, so, thank you.
Plumbers don't wear ties.
Anyway, so there
sorry
you go,
for
ladies
voice
and
that just
gentlemen.
doesn't
That
happen.
was a fun conversation. Look back at the company that was 3DO, 91 to 2003, RIP. with that, I will say this real quick. The next show will be March 5th, 9 p.m. Eastern. Of course, you'll have to do the thing on your own, wherever you live. I'm not calculating that shit for you. It's getting late. I'm getting tired, but I'm going to still play Monster Hunter afterwards.
Yeah, you are.
Yeah.
Can I say one more thing?
Yeah, Nick, go ahead.
All right, I mentioned MVP Baseball tonight. I miss MVP Baseball. However, it coming back would mean EA is handling it, so no.
Well, yeah, I want Bases Loaded back, but Jellicoe isn't around to publish them. So, yeah. We're all going to suffer in our own little ways. So, with that, anybody want to make any plugs? Mark? Jan? Mark?
Not at this time.
No plugs? Jan, do you want to plug anything?
I'm actually starting to do regular streams every weekend on Fridays and Saturdays, from about 8:30 to about 11. It's still kind of a work in progress. I don't really have anything super fancy lined up for it, but it's mostly just me playing the games that I play, which is usually Final Fantasy XIV, Monster Hunter, Final Fantasy Dissidia, and a variety of random mobile collection games that I've been playing. So it's just me hanging out with people, having fun, playing games. It's really nothing super fancy, but I'm trying to get back into the regular swing of things, and it's worked out pretty well so far. So, yeah, I mean,
all right.
I
What's
still
your?
I still do my regular streams every Saturday, starting 8:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, give or take, at twitch.tv/MarkBWriting.
And
this past week we did Monster Hunter World, but the week before that we did a board game, Vanguard of War, and I like to try and alternate live board games with video games of various types. So, if you're into seeing live board games played by people so you can just check them out or see if there's something you'd want to add to your collection, you want to see various and sundry different video games, whatever works for you, feel free to tune in.
So are you going to play Fear in the future?
Yes, I've had a few people starting to tell me that I should be doing horror games, and that because of that, my reaction is perfect for said things. Thanks, Mark.
That was hilarious.
So,
no!
Oh no!
What's your channel, by the way, Jan?
It is wonderfully just not the same spelling because I'm terribly inconsistent about that kind of crap. It is twitch.tv/ExcaliburMight, but it's MYTE, not MYGHT. This is what happens when Twitter makes you have to use a different version of your name. But yeah, you guys can always stop on by ExcaliburMight. That's me. I'll probably put a quick link in the chat just so that we can make sure if you want to stop by on Fridays and Saturdays, by all means, come on up and we'll go from there. Like I said, I'm probably going to start working on horror games at some point in the near future. We'll see what happens, I guess. I don't know. We'll figure it out.
And
Just
how
don't
about
stream at the same time that I'm streaming, or I'll have to kill you.
He was very nice about it, at least.
Look, we co-stream. It's not a big deal. We were both playing the same game. It worked out that time.
Yeah.
I'm not co-streaming with Five Nights at Freddy's. I played that game already. I don't need to play it ever again.
No, I'm not even going to touch that game. Get that
What about Planet
No,
of the
I'm absolutely
Polterzoids?
going to make sure that you stream that fucking thing. I'm
know
going
what?
to give you every one of them.
I got a game I'm going to give you, Jen. You'll probably get a good laugh out of it and get scared at the same time.
Oh, good. This is fine. Everybody give me 4 games so that I can start playing those here soon. That'll be
And
fun.
Nick, you seem to be getting left out here. What kind of things would you like to plug?
Follow my Twitter for my dumb bullshit if you want.
You said it
Since
so
I don't-
casually.
I don't really have anything else to plug otherwise, so I will say I'll plug a game and say play Freedom Wars on the Vita if you can. I just started playing that game again recently, and it's a Monster Hunter clone, but it's a really good one, and I think it's one of the standout games on that system.
I agree. I definitely agree with that. That game is really weird, but really interesting.
It's a good game. I like it a lot. I really like the setting and the world it established. I'm honestly surprised that Sony didn't bring it over to PS4 since they did the same for Gravity Rush. I mean, Gravity Rush deserves it, don't get me wrong. That game's really good too, but surprised they didn't do it with Freedom Wars because that game needs more attention than it's gotten. Deserves it.
I think we'll
It's
see.
good.
With Monster Hunter still being as popular as it is, and especially with the explosion of Monster Hunter World, I would not be surprised if we see another Freedom Wars sooner rather than later, with its crazy-ass panopticons and personal kidnappings of robots and everything else.
Yeah, and a million-year prison sentence
That
that
was
you
just
gotta
some
work
weird
off.
shit I heard.
It is a very weird take on the Monster Hunter concept, on the hunting action concept.
If you take more steps than you should, your jail sentence gets 10 more years tacked onto it. It's nuts.
There's jail sentences.
You have to earn,
You're in prison in the game if you do anything outside of your basic when people are born in that world, you're born with a prison sentence just for existing, and then as you exist through life, you do things
Sounds
that
like
can
a North Korean
increase or decrease
concentration
it.
camp.
Whoa!
the game's nuts. It's great. You have to earn the right to lie down.
Yeah, it definitely sounds like a North Korean
crazy.
concentration camp.
Oh, but seriously, it's a good game. People should try it.
All
It's
right.
really good.
So I'm gonna plug my shit. All right. So aside of bi-weekly on Monday nights with GVN Live, opposite Mondays I do my Free Step Dodge Dead or Alive 5 online tournaments. Tuesdays and Wednesdays. On Tuesdays, I stream Game Jam, which is just me and a bunch of friends playing a bunch of weird games online. I don't know what we're playing tomorrow, but last Tuesday we played Dead by Daylight. Wednesday is also our Three Vets and a Noob show, where it's me and my regular crew of Lance, Matt, and Rico as we, play games that Rico I've never played before. Right now, we are now traversing through Borderlands 2, having a lot of fun as we go. So definitely tune in. All those shows start 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So with that, I want to thank Mark, Jan, and Nick for joining me tonight.
Thanks for having us again.
And
Definitely.
to everybody out there, have a good night.
Night.